Now let us talk about the metastasis. Metastasis can occur to any bone, but phalangeal metastasis or tarsal metastasis, they can happen, any bone for that matter, but they are very rare, unlikely to happen is what need to be remembered. Whenever our thumb become adducted and abducted, what are the joints which are involved? Both carpometacarpal and also the metacarpophalangeal joint are the ones which are involved in the adduction, and the abduction of our thumb is what need to be remembered. Diabetic and hypertensive retinopathy is a very common topic in exam, doctor. Everything and anything we need to know. The earliest clinical sign is the identification of this microaneurysms in the diabetic retinopathy. Dot and blot hemorrhages can occur, flame shaped hemorrhages, hard exudates, retinal edema, presence of this kind of cotton wool spots which are because of the infarction which is happening along the nerve fiber layers, and fluorescein angiography can show the perfusion abnormalities, and there are a set of abnormalities called as the IRMA in the case of diabetic retinopathy. What is IRMA, doctor? Intraretinal microvascular abnormalities are one of the important indication of the proliferative diabetic retinopathy is what I like to underscore to all of you. And in diabetic retinopathy, what is the cause of the blindness? Macular edema is one of the most common causes for the blindness that you come across. Now quickly stratify the diabetic retinopathy, doctor, into mild, moderate and severe. It is called as the mild, non-proliferative if there is only one microaneurysm, which is the earliest clinical sign. It is called moderate if hemorrhages, microaneurysm, hard exudate, soft exudates, venous bleeding, and IRMA is there, but IRMA is not that severe to show the proliferative changes. Until then it is called as the moderate. The moment you have microaneurysms in all the 4 quarters of the fundus with the hemorrhage, venous bleeding in at least 2 quadrants and the IRMA in at least 1 quadrant, then it is typically called the severe, still non-proliferative type of diabetic retinopathy. That is how you stratify. So what is the carry home message for the next entrance? Microaneurysms are considered to be the earliest clinical sign that you typically see on fundoscopic examination. Now what are the 3 common tumors which typically metastasize to the bone? All of you know breast will metastasize, thyroid also. Is the question, options are given in the same order, A, B, C, tick and then stop. So the third is the prostate. They are all notorious to undergo a metastasis to the bone, and spine is the part of the skeleton that is most commonly affected out of all whenever there are any bony metastasis. Then comes the pelvis, the second most common site. Then renal cell carcinoma also in fact can undergo metastasis, but more than the bone it undergoes metastasis to the lung much more frequently, 75% of times. What is important about renal cell carcinoma metastasis to the lung, doctor? They are pulsating vascular metastasis which can lead to hemoptysis is what need to be basically remembered. Adrenal pheochromocytoma, favorite question of the examiner. What is the investigation of choice? CT, adrenal. Extraadrenal, MIBG scan is the one which is considered to be the investigation of choice is what need to be remembered. So MIBG is having specificity, CT is having the sensitivity, but in spite of that MIBG is the one, especially whenever you are suspecting the extraadrenal pheos, you have to use it as a screening procedure is what need to be remembered. Now what are paragangliomas? What is the common misnomer for them? They are also called glomus tumor, but that glomus tumor should not be confused with the glomus tumor subungually that you come across. So there is a reason, doctor. Paragangliomas are typically found in the abdomen, thorax, in the head and neck area, and generally they are considered to be benign, and complete surgical removal is considered to be the treatment of choice. And from where are they originating from? There are glomus cells from which these paragangliomas are basically originating from. And can they be a part of multiple endocrine neoplasia? Paragangliomas, very much, especially for the type 2A and type 2B, and SDH gene mutations also can be associated with the paraganglioma is what need to be remembered. Finally, there are 5 paragangliomas recognized: carotid paraganglioma, glomus tympanicum and jugular, vagal paraganglioma, and rarely you can also have paragangliomas in the larynx, nasal cavity, paranasal sinus, thyroid, and even bladder also sometimes in rare cases is what I like to underscore to all of you. There is deafness, goiter, mental retardation. What is that combination called? Pendred syndrome, where the gene is located on the long arm of the chromosome 7. Now one of the challenges here is it bilateral or unilateral hearing loss? Bilateral very much. Then how is the cochlea? The classical feature, why there is a sensorineural deafness in the case of Pendred syndrome, doctor? The pathology lies with the vestibular aqueduct, which is typically abnormal, and also that is there is a dilatation of the vestibular aqueduct, and also there is a cochlear hypoplasia. So cochlea is not normal, and that is the reason there is a sensorineural deafness congenitally in those who are having the Pendred is what need to be basically remembered. Now there is another common question in the entrance, emergency contraception. What are the different methods available? Progestin only method, where you will be giving levonorgestrel in a dose of 1.5 milligram, either as 750 microgram 2 tablets 12 hours apart can be used, or as a single dose also can be used. What is Eustace method, where both estrogen and progestin combined 2 doses are taken at 12-hour interval, and mifepristone can be used. In fact, it can be used both as an abortifacient and also an emergency contraceptive measure. And also the norgestrel, which is one of the levonorgestrel's component, that also can be by itself can be very much be used in emergency contraception protocols. We must be doubly sure, including the dosages also. Now let us talk about the vasodilator effect. Nitrous oxide is being identified, which is used in primary pulmonary hypertension in the form of sildenafil, and also in the case of management of impotence. HDL is called as the good cholesterol, triglyceride, LDL, everything are all bad. And our favorite question, hemolytic uremic syndrome, thrombotic thrombocytopenic purpura. All of you know, fragmented RBCs, schistocytes will be found, and there is thrombocytopenia, abnormal fibrin formation, renal failure, focal neurological deficits, along with the fever, which is called the Raynaud's pentad, which you come across in the case of TTP. Without neurological involvement, it is called HUS, is what need to be remembered. Let us talk about ectopic pregnancy. What are the important risk factors? Pelvic inflammatory disease is undoubtedly an important risk factor. Earlier there was a history of ectopic pregnancy that will increase the risk to 7 to 13 fold. Similarly, there was a history of tubal ligation or any tubal surgery that also increases the risk in the case of for the ectopic pregnancy. And we are all in the modern era of infertility clinics where clomiphene is given and gonadotropin releasing hormone analogs for induction of ovulation are being given. So in all such assisted conception methods, they all increase the risk of a abnormal implantation is what need to be remembered. And those who are having the intrauterine contraceptive device, especially that which is having the progesterone, they are highly vulnerable to develop it. Increasing age and smoking, they are all the other important risk factors. Massive splenomegaly. What are all the situations where you come across? Malaria, CML, myelofibrosis, myelometaplasia, Kala-Azar, schistosomiasis, Gaucher, Niemann-Pick, Cooley's anemia, asymptomatic sarcoidosis also sometimes can lead to the development of splenomegaly. So that is the reason you must be sure what are all the causes for the development. Are there 2 questions about splenomegaly really? Good. Sometimes 5 questions will be there on the topic which we have ignored. 5 questions on let us say Rokitansky-Kushner-Horsner syndrome. So what will you do in exam? So you feel already 1 year is gone, another 1 year is being suicidal because of this rarer entity. It should not be ideally. I mean generally it won't be like that, but some exams Helicobacter pylori 8 questions will be there in one entrance, it was like that. So you have never read Helicobacter means you are totally out. So that's the reason no ignorance or anything, giving justification as much possible to all common topics. Let us talk about the Human Development Index, doctor. KILL, K for knowledge, I for I for 3, no, longevity, income. They are the 3 things. So longevity by life expectancy at birth, not at 1 year. Education is assessed by literacy rate and combined gross emolument ratio, and income is by the GDP per capita. They are the 3 components of the human development index is what need to be remembered. Which hypervitaminosis can lead to the development of osteoporosis? Hypervitaminosis D can cause excess calcium, which can have the porotic effects on the bone. Even hypervitaminosis A is the one which is associated with the development of bony abnormalities is what need to be remembered. Then only one more hypervitaminosis is there, hypervitaminosis E. Then what do you come across in that? Coagulopathy can be there, congestive heart failure will be seen with the vitamin E toxicity. Constitutional and GI effects, impaired immunity, increased mortality, not something with the bone. So that is not associated. D is associated, A is associated, anyway B and C are water soluble, there is no chance of their accumulation at all. Now let's go to the next question. Breast conservation surgery, what you are able to see here, doctor? It is a lumpectomy scar which is typically found, which is called as the breast conservation surgery. So as a part of breast conservation, what are all the things that you do? Sentinel lymph node biopsy is done using the technetium 99M labeled sulfur colloid. Axillary dissection is also being done, and then lumpectomy is considered with a breast conserving surgery, and post lumpectomy you can also give radiation therapy of around 4500 to 5000 centigrade as a part of the breast conservation surgery. There are the 4 maneuvers which are done, not the they are the 4 important components. Now let us go to the next question. Asbestos exposure leads to mesothelioma, all of you agree with that. It also leads to bronchogenic carcinoma in the non-smokers. But what are the other rare things which we ignore about asbestosis? Still it is unfortunately implicated. Upper respiratory tract malignancies like the carcinoma larynx, esophageal malignancy, biliary malignancies, renal cell carcinoma, even it is implicated, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Even colon cancer, brain tumors also, glioblastoma, multiforme, astrocytoma, it is implicated. So there are all the things examiner is expecting, not just the mesothelioma, stomach, colon, larynx, bronchogenic, everything is, so little rarely it is implicated is what need to be remembered. Turner syndrome is the monosomy XO, primary amenorrhea, most common cause it is. Now the question comes, what are the cardiovascular abnormalities that you come across in Turner's? If I ask you a question, what is the most common cardiovascular cardiology problem in Turner people? Coarctation of aorta will be the answer, but that is not the answer. So that's what, it's a good guess but not a correct answer. The correct answer is bicuspid aortic valve is the most common congenital heart disease that you come across in the case of the Turner's. Then the second comes where 5% to 10% will have coarctation of aorta, whereas 15% will have bicuspid aortic valve. Then partial anomalous venous drainage is the third important problem that you can come across. Can vaccination can cause intussusception? I mean, is there any relationship between Narmada Dam and somebody becoming pregnant? There is no relationship. So, but still studies will prove that OPV if you give, there is increased incidence of intussusception in the population, studies have shown. So they have implicated OPV and intussusception also. But still it is not proven, but it became an entrance question. Even rotaviral, though we don't practice, in developed countries they do that. Rotaviral vaccination also is associated with increased incidence of the intussusception is what need to be remembered. Now, of course, you can plead your medical officer next time. As a house surgeon, if you bunk, why did you not come on the immunization day? No sir, it will increase the intussusception. So I have done it wrong in my PGH Chandigarh. Anyway, I am depressed, so I am not coming to posting, not going to the library. So, but some studies prove. Now, what are the important things produced by the kidney, doctor? Erythropoietin, renin, kinins, prostaglandins, 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol. They are the ones which are typically produced by the kidney. Hemolytic anemia, G6PD deficiency. Another, what is the traditional question? Without that you feel that did I come to Indian entrance exam hall or not? intermittent porphyria and safe and unsafe drugs. You must be damn sure about these things. So dapsone, flutamide, mafenide cream and nitrofurantoin, primaquine, sulfacetamide, sulfalinamide, all sulfur derivatives, they are all very much associated. I don't find any of these associated. It is primaquine, not the chloroquine. I am not sure whether losartan and hydralazine are associated. Any reference, please let me know. Okay. Now, bilateral hilar lymphadenopathy, non-caseating granuloma. What is your diagnosis? Sarcoidosis, excellent. So must be all got a deja vu feeling while answering the PGI paper. Lungs are the ones which are commonly affected. It is not cataract that you see. It is the uveitis that you come across, definitely. And there can be neurosarcoidosis, myocardial involvement, arthritis can be there, anemia, leukopenia, hypercalcemia, diabetes insipidus, because this sarcoid can cause the hypothalamic pituitary axis to become damaged. That can lead to decreased production of the ADH by the pituitary, which can lead to diabetes insipidus, which can be seen in the case of the sarcoidosis is what need to be remembered. Renal failure also can be seen. What are the classical manifestations of sarcoidosis in the skin, doctor? Erythema nodosum, which is also called paniculitis, inflammation of the fat tissue can be found. Lupus pernio, this kind of lesions on the skin which are found. Lupus pernio is another cutaneous manifestation. Now, in which conditions do you require the drainage procedure? Whichever the peptic ulcer surgery procedures that are causing decreased motility of the stomach. So, highly selective vagotomy does not lead to any decreased motility. It will only affect the parietal cell mass, but not the motility of the GIT, stomach. Hence, it does not require the drainage procedure. What was the recent exam question in AIIMS? Billroth surgery. So, this is one high yield topic, doctor, that we have to clearly understand where are the drainage links are given in Billroth type 1, type 2, what are the complications, early late dumping syndrome. So, these are all you must brush very well before going to exam. According to the American Heart Association, CPR, whenever you are doing, how many number of chest compressions you should give in the neonate? There are two questions that come on the American Heart Association CPR. What is the depth of compression, compression rate and compression ventilation ratio? Typically the compression depth should be 1 to 1.5 to 2 inches and compression rate must be around 100 per minute and compression ventilation ratio should be 30:2 is they are the three things to remember about the CPR. Now let us talk about the gestational diabetes. RBS, random blood sugar value. Based on that, can you decide gestational diabetes? What is the criteria of the fasting blood sugar and the random blood sugar in gestational diabetes? But before that, when do you suspect gestational diabetes? How do you evaluate gestational diabetes? Is a very common question. 1 hour 50 grams glucose challenge test, result is showing greater than 130 milligrams per deciliter of blood sugar. Then that is the indication for you to evaluate thoroughly by doing continuing your glucose tolerance test. Then you have to give 100 grams of glucose loading. After giving that, the 1 hour value, which is 180 and more, fasting value 95 and more, 2 hours value 155 and more, 3 hours value 140 and more, is considered to be the criteria for you to call in 100 grams of glucose loading test. They are the criteria to define the gestational diabetes. Now, what are the specific subset of populations where it is mandatory that you perform the gestational diabetes screening as a gynecologist and obstetrician? Age, which is more than 35, obesity, when do you define it as? Greater than 90 kgs, and fasting glucose greater than 140 or the random glucose greater than 200 milligrams per deciliter. So the answer is D, more than 200 milligrams per deciliter of random blood sugar value is the indication for evaluating for the gestational diabetes. Let us talk about the fat embolism. Diabetes is a risk factor which will increase it, and also the hypovolemic shock also. Those who are the burns patients, liposuction, cardiopulmonary bypass, decompression sickness, acute pancreatitis, they are all the risk factors for the development of the pulmonary embolism. I mean fat embolism is what has to be remembered. Now what are the indications for cholecystectomy is a very important question. How about the strawberry gallbladder, doctor? Very benign condition. A good number of people can have it, but that is not the indication for the cholecystectomy. That is a carry home message about this question. These questions we had a great amount of discussion earlier also. Now question comes, practical question. A patient has gallstones, totally asymptomatic. Radiologist has given an ultrasound report that there are gallstones. Is it an indication? It is not the indication. Excellent. So asymptomatic gallstones, unless they are medically complicating, cholecystectomy is discouraged, but there are certain subset of populations, though they have asymptomatic gallstones, they fall under risk group. Though gallstone is still asymptomatic, where you have to operate. Tell me those subsets, doctor. Those who are having gallstones which are asymptomatic and having an underlying cirrhosis, let us say he is an alcoholic. Similarly, portal hypertension, sickle cell disease, children, those who are the transplant candidates, and diabetes with minor symptoms if they have. Even though gallstones are asymptomatic, that is the indication for cholecystectomy, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now another common question, porcelain gallbladder. Is it an indication? Very much, because it increases the risk of the gallbladder cancer. How about strawberry gallbladder? What is the other name given for it? It is also called cholesterolosis of the gallbladder. It is a very benign condition, no clinical significance at all. That is the reason it is not an indication for the cholecystectomy, is what I like to underscore. Now the question comes, between acute and chronic cholecystitis, option A and B, what is the indication? When a patient comes in acute cholecystitis, on that hot gallbladder you can't place the knife. Let the inflammation subside, give the antibiotics, stabilize the patient, IV fluids, and then after a period of time, then you do the interval cholecystectomy. That is considered to be the indication, not on the acute gallbladder, is what need to be remembered. Metabolic acidosis is a complication of the ethylene glycol poisoning, and even in the case of the salicylate toxicity also. What are the features in salicylate toxicity, doctor? Hypoglycemia, anion gap acidosis, hyponatremia, hypokalemia, all of them can be found. And ethylene glycol poisoning can cause accumulation of glycolic acid, oxalic acid, and that is the reason that can lead to development of metabolic acidosis, is what need to be remembered. It was long time I discussed a question on cubital fossa. All our first dissection as we enter into the anatomy lecture hall, let us talk about it. The superficial boundary of that is formed by the deep fascia, which is covering the bicipital aponeurosis. The floor is formed by the brachialis and supinator muscles, and the superior boundary is that imaginary line which is connecting the medial and the lateral epicondyle of the humerus, and the medial border is the pronata teres and the lateral boundary is the brachioradialis. So you can clearly see the radial artery and the ulnar artery are dividing from the branchial artery, and you can also see the tendon of the biceps which is over here. Then there is a radial nerve here, and this is the brachioradialis, this is the pronata teres, and this is the imaginary line between the two condyles, is what has to be remembered. In fact, we studied in Telugu medium until the medical college. So those days, what is lateral, what is dorsal, what is ventral, by the time we understood, only 4 months is gone. So another 2-3 months is in what you call spending fine time along with the classmates at the dissection table. Of course, that is the situation with everyone's life in the dissection hall. So especially this kind of terms, imaginary line, why to imagine? So what is this imaginary line and all this used to be, and also even femoral triangle also. It is the lateral boundary of a muscle becomes the medial border of the triangle. So never understood that funda also. So but anyway, life is much simpler than all these things. Another common question asked is, what are the contents? That is the question asked. The radial nerve, not the ulnar nerve, the median nerve, and the biceps brachii and the brachial artery. These are all the constituents. Let us forget about the radial nerve. What are from the lateral towards medial, doctor? Tendon is most lateral. then comes the artery, brachial artery, and then comes the median nerve, which are the lateral to the medial structures, is what has to be remembered. Now, amino transfusion, what are the indications? That is basically in order to hasten the labor during the delivery. If you do the amniotomy, it can spread the infection and lead to it can lead to amnionitis, and cord prolapse also is one of the important risk factors. Now, how much of glucose you must administer to do the glucose tolerance test in pediatric population and in adult population? Adults, it is 75 grams at max, whereas in the case of the children it is 1.75 grams of glucose per kg of body weight. So 20 kgs individual is there, 20 into 1.75, somewhere nearer to 30 to 35 grams is what you have to give. Now divide the gastroenteritis, doctor. Inflammatory, non-inflammatory and invasive gastroenteritis is the broad division. So Shigella, Salmonella, Campylobacter, entero-invasive, entero-hemorrhagic, Vibrio vulnificus, Yersinia, Francisella, H. pylori, Entamoeba, they are all the examples of invasive gastroenteritis. Whereas Staph aureus, Bacillus, Clostridium perfringens and botulinum, they are non-inflammatory. Whereas all these invasive agents plus rotavirus, Norwalk, they are all examples of inflammatory gastroenteritis, and typically you find the fecal leukocytes in the stool examination whenever there is an invasive pathogen is what need to be remembered. A daily laborer after the heavy work goes to the bed and next day he has paralysis of 4 limbs. Was the option was also hypokalemic periodic paralysis was there? I like to know from those who took the exam. It's not there. Then I could not find a possibility of a viper or a kite biting him. Any of the any logic is there in some rare page of forensic medicine textbook? I'm not sure about. Then but acute infective demyelinating polyneuropathy is a possibility, but the question is history of fever will be there. Guillain-Barré syndrome, there will be a history of fever. So is the history of fever is there in the history? It is not there. So I'm not quite sure what could be the possibilities. Still 2 options were not recalled. Now Raynaud's phenomena, Raynaud's disease. What is the difference between these two, doctor? Raynaud's phenomena is called secondary Raynaud's because there is an underlying condition which is leading to the development of it. That's the reason it is called secondary. Whereas primarily some people have a vasospastic tendency which is called the Raynaud's disease. So disease is not secondary, phenomena is the one which is secondary, is what you need to basically remember. And phenomena is a reversible ischemia in the peripheral arterioles. Conditions like progressive systemic sclerosis, mixed connective tissue disease can lead to development of a vasospasm leading to the Raynaud's phenomena, is what I like to underscore to all of you. Now the question comes, is it male or female predominant condition? Typically it is more often seen in the case of the women than in the case of the men. So B is wrong about it. It is not male, it is female predominance. And does it involve lower limb or only always the fingers? Both fingers, even toes also can show the Raynaud's phenomena. So it is not an exception. So there is a reason A is a possibility, unless if he asked most commonly involves lower limb, that is wrong. More commonly it is the fingers, but definitely also involves the lower limbs. So what are the favorite questions of the examiner, doctor? What are the systemic conditions causing the Raynaud's phenomena? It can be a part of the paraneoplastic presentation like the lymphoma, leukemia, myeloma, Waldenstrom's macroglobulinemia, adenocarcinoma, it can be a part of it. And certain lead and arsenic exposure, endocrinological conditions like acromegaly, myxedema, diabetes, pheochromocytoma, hematological conditions like cryofibrinogenemia, and drugs like bromocriptine, ergot, oral contraceptives, antineoplastics like Vinca alkaloids also can cause Raynaud's. That's the reason, doctor, we must be sure what are all the underlying causes leading to the development of the Raynaud's. Now what is Riter's triad? He can't see, uveitis is there, he can't pee, urethritis is there, he can't climb because there is a arthritis. The triad of the Riter's, reactive arthritis, is what need to be remembered. So he does not have cataract, he does not have glaucoma. What he has is uveitis, for which he is unable to see. Anterior uveitis is a very important feature. Then papillary versus follicular carcinoma, traditional question. Papillary is by the lymphatic spread. Now this is a very interesting question, doctor. You can put in the top 500 topics before the exam. Like Forbes magazine says world's 500 fortune people. Anti-epileptic drugs is a topic frequently tested. Let us become the masters. How does valproate act, doctor? In fact, most of the drugs, they will cause sodium channel inhibition. So valproate is also one such drug. It has got an anti-convulsant action, mood stabilizing effect, used in the bipolar disorder also, migraine headache, schizophrenia, multiple indications are there. And also it will affect the function of the GABA, the neurotransmitter. That is very important property of the valproate. So what are all the drugs, anti-epileptics, which will cause the sodium channel to become inhibited? Quickly summarize, doctor. Phenytoin, carbamazepine, valproate and lamotrigine typically will show a voltage dependent blockade of the sodium channels is what has to be remembered. Now many anti-epileptics which are especially useful for the absence seizures, what is the common property of them? They basically block the calcium currents. Now which are those which are important, show this kind of action? Ethosuximide, trimethadione and metsuximide, their underlying mechanism is they are capable of causing the blockade of the calcium. Now what is the relation between the calcium channel blockade and the absence seizures, doctor? What is the part of the brain which is important for the absence seizures? Thalamus. So there are the high density of these calcium channels in the thalamus, and because this drug ethosuximide is capable of blocking it, it is capable of stopping the absence seizures is what need to be remembered. Then lot of anti-epileptics have got an ability to stimulate the GABA release, which is the inhibitory neurotransmitter. Diazepam and clonazepam are the ones which are typically belonging to this important group. Now the question comes, barbiturates, phenobarbital also is an anti-epileptic, and diazepam, which is a benzodiazepine, is also a example of an anti-epileptic. Both of them will act on the GABA, they increase the release of the GABA. But why we use in the casualty when the patient comes, why we use so frequently the diazepam instead of using the phenobarbital? Of course you will say that phenobarbital causes respiratory depression, which I don't want, hence I use diazepam. That is one reason. There is a reason number two also. Diazepam like benzodiazepines are highly selective for one of the subset of the GABA receptor called the GABA A receptor. Whereas such a selectivity is not there in the case of the barbiturates. And that selectivity is very, very important, especially for blocking the generalized absence seizures. So barbiturates are incapable of stopping the generalized absence seizures, whereas benzodiazepines, diazepam like drugs, which are very specific for the GABA A, they are much more effective is what you need to basically remember. Then comes the tiagabine and vigabatrin. They increase the levels of the GABA by a simple mechanism. Either they prevent the, typically they will prevent the reuptake of GABA, so that GABA is not reuptaken, so its level will increase, or they prevent the degradation of the GABA. So that is what examiner is specifically testing. The fourth option, the GABA transaminase, which is the degrader of the GABA, is inhibited by the vigabatrin, which will in turn cause the GABA levels in the CSF to become elevated. That is the underlying mechanism for its anti-epileptic action is what need to be remembered. Whereas its very close friend tiagabine, it will typically cause interference with the reuptake of the GABA, which also will cause the GABA levels to increase. That is the mechanism of the tiagabine is what need to be remembered. Then lastly comes the lamotrigine. Lamotrigine is basically having an action on the sodium channel, just like the phenytoin and also the carbamazepine. So that is the underlying mechanism. Let us go to the next question. Traditional question. What are the components of the Bishop score, doctor? Position of the fetus, consistency of the cervix, effacement, dilatation, baby station. Accordingly you have the scores which are being given. How do you interpret that, doctor? But before that, when you calculate the Bishop score, are there any other factors which will make you to modify the Bishop score? Definitely. If at all patient also had preeclampsia or if at all there is any prior vaginal delivery, try to add 1 point to the Bishop score which you calculated. And if it is a post-dated pregnancy or a nulliparous woman, or if there is any premature or a prolonged rupture of membranes, then subtract 1 point from the Bishop score. And what are the indications where you have to, after calculating Bishop score, when do you like to go for prostaglandins and other drugs which will cause cervical ripening? When the Bishop score is less than 5. And what is the indication for the labor induction, doctor, with the oxytocin? When the Bishop score is greater than 5, that's the reason Bishops is very important. Then another scoring system is being asked, Child-Pugh scoring system of the cirrhosis of the liver into the grade A, B and C. So for the next June, what are the question left over? Apache scoring is also there, and so many, what is there? They will make the scores, we have to remember, right? So we have 5 components: B for bilirubin, A for ascites, banana, N for the nutritional status, serum albumin and prothrombin time, they are all the important components. So accordingly 5 to 6 is called grade A, 7 to 9 grade B, and 10 to 15 is grade C, is how you basically calculate. Let's go to the next question. What is struma ovarii? First of all, it is benign entity. It is containing teratoma. It is there in the ovary and it is having an ectopic thyroid tissue inside it. So it is a benign ovarian tumor which is predominantly teratoma, which rarely undergoes a malignant transformation, which is having the ectopic thyroid tissue. Now the question comes, anywhere thyroid tissue can lead to hyperthyroidism. Can struma ovariae can cause? Struma ovarian is very less likely to cause thyrotoxicosis to develop. A 10 days old child has meningitis. Common question, neonatal meningitis, what are the underlying causes? Group B streptococcus is the most commonly identified organism. Then comes the E. coli, which is the second important, and third comes the Listeria monocytogenes. They are all transmitted through the vertical transmission. So is agalactaceae same as group B streptococcus? Definitely. So that is the most important cause. Even viral causes like HSV, varicella zoster, they are the other important known causes which can lead to development of neonatal meningitis. Some Sundays we used to have a easy test paper. So PGI December 2007 also is like that discussion is the feeling I am getting. Not, they're all traditional questions. I am not able to see even till now. Any new questions, variety is being seen, nothing. So that's even any entrance will be like that, doctor. 80% will be common questions. Revising past 10 years of AIIMS All India PGI along with reading the basic books. That's more than enough. You don't need entrance coaching also. But we run because we don't have any time to do. So that is the only reason. Now this is a good question. Steroids are given to the patient and in spite of giving it for 6 weeks, still the resolution of symptomatology is not there and his peak expiratory flow rate is around 72%. What do you want to do for this patient? What is that treatment called as, doctor? Step-up therapy. Let us look into it. The step 1 is the intermittent symptoms occurring less than 1 week with brief exacerbations and nocturnal symptoms less than twice a month, and individual is asymptomatic with a normal lung function and the FEV1 and PEF is 80%. Then there is no need for any specific daily medication at all for such patient. It's called mild persistent when it is occurring more than once in a week or less than once in a day, but less than once in a day. That is called as mild persistent. There we have to give inhaled steroid, which is low dose, and cromolyn. Puffs need to be given. And here the FEV1 rate is greater than 80% of that of the predicted value. Then moderate persistent is daily symptoms are happening and exacerbations are causing the sleep disturbance of the patient and his spouse also. Nocturnal symptoms are occurring more than once a week. Then that is the indication for inhaled steroid of a medium dose and a long acting bronchodilator and a sustained release theophylline, they all need to be given. And the PEF value will be between 60 to 80%. What is the value given? 72%. So our patient falls into which group? Moderate persistent group. And what is he receiving? Only steroid. So do you like to do something else for that? Add one theophylline, add also the beta agonist, then that will take care of the problem. So try to change the drugs, rather add some more new drugs other than the steroids. That is what need to be done. And severe persistent people, they need to take the high dose inhaled steroid and a long acting bronchodilator, and when do you call based on PEF? PEF less than 60% is called as the severe persistent.